Well, let's do a little review before we jump in here. Last week we saw Jesus come to the end of this long journey he had made from Galilee up in the north on his way to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. Came through Jericho, and then he made a final leg from Jericho to Jerusalem. And as he traveled down during these several months, he spent a lot of time talking to the crowds about the kingdom of God. The Jews immediately thought that he was talking about this political kingdom that the prophets spoke of. And they were eager to throw off the shackles of Rome, so they were receptive to a lot of what he was saying. But Jesus told them that this kingdom wasn't coming right away. First, he would have to suffer and die, be resurrected, and ascend into heaven. And then later, he would return from heaven. And at that time, he would set up this millennial kingdom, this political kingdom. In the meantime, there would be an invisible internal kingdom that we are a part of now, where the Holy Spirit lives in the hearts of all believers. Then last week, we saw that Jesus made the entrance from the Mount of Olives, or sometimes called Olivet, and he made that last 2-mile journey from there into the city of Jerusalem. And we saw that the people there received him there, and the great crowds following him along the way. They continued to follow him, as some ran ahead of him and laid down their coats and branches in the road. Others came out from the city of Jerusalem to greet him. And so it was really quite a spectacle. Thousands and thousands of people stretched on for 2 miles. A little different than the pictures you sometimes see painted of that entrance on what we call Palm Sunday. So we reviewed that last week, and then we saw that as he was on his way to the city, he came to a point on the road where the city came into full view, and that caused him to weep. He says that he wept, and we said that word there meant that he was sobbing, almost weeping uncontrollably. So here's the scene of all the people yelling Hosanna and praising and excited, and Jesus is just weeping on the back of his colt. So quite a contrast. But he was weeping because he knew that as much as he loved the city, he loved these people, he knew that they were going to reject him. And they were going to pay the price for that. And in 70 AD, indeed, the city and the temple were destroyed, they were burned to the ground. Well, tonight we're going to see Jesus in the temple, and this is really his first order of business as he went to Jerusalem. So I'm going to read these verses, and as I do, if we could go ahead and make note of any important words or phrases there, we'll jot them down before we go on. So this is kind of an overview for us of these verses. So Luke 19, beginning in verse 45. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And he was teaching daily in the temple. The chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words. Okay, so what important words did you notice there?
Drive out.
Drive out.
It was written.
Also prayer.
Teaching daily.
Okay, great. This is a good roadmap there for where we're going. Okay. So last week, as we talked about that journey that Jesus made from Jericho to the Mount of Olives and then down to Jerusalem, we spent a little time talking about the geography there and the fact that Jericho was down the valley. You had to come up to the higher parts to get to the Mount of Olives, and then slide downward gone down into Jerusalem. Well, this week, I think we're again going to benefit from understanding some of the physical layout as described here, and also some of the history surrounding the temple. So these verses are pretty simple, they're very familiar, the message is really straightforward, but I think if we understand some of the layout and some of the other history in the background here, it'll mean a lot more to us, so we're going to take a little time to do that. So first of all, let's do a quick review of the history of the temple that was in Jerusalem. We had, initially, there was a first temple, and that was the temple that was built by Solomon. Here's an artist rendering of that temple. And it was renowned for its craftsmanship and its beauty. It was very elaborate, and almost everything was covered in gold. The walls were cedar panels, but they had gold leaf over them, and a lot of the furniture had gold leaf all over it, so it was very elaborate, a very beautiful temple. Well, this temple was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came in 586 BC, which led to what we call the Babylonian captivity, where the Jews were taken away to Babylon. And then, as God promised, they were restored back to Jerusalem. And at that time, Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple. And this is by the decree of Cyrus, who was the king of the Persian Empire, who had taken over from the Babylonians. Now, this temple was nothing like Solomon's. It wasn't near as grand. We think that they probably used some of the same foundations, but we read that some of the older men who came back with Ezra and Nehemiah, when they saw the new temple, they wept because it was nothing in comparison to the grandeur of the old temple. But this was used for many years by the Jews after that time of captivity. Well, then, advance about 400 years, and Herod the Great becomes king. We've said previously how he was a very ambitious builder, and so Herod's temple is the one that was standing in Jesus' day. And it looks something like this. This is a mock-up that's been done. There's a place outside Jerusalem where there's a mosque for the city, and this is a part of that. So Herod greatly expanded the temple, and it looks something like this. Now, there's a big courtyard around there, and the temple itself may not have been dead center as it looks here. It may have been off more to one side. We're not completely sure of that. But he greatly enlarged this shortly after he became the king in 37 BC. The first thing he did was build this fortress up in the top right corner. That's called the Antonia Fortress, and it was the area where the Roman soldiers were housed. And then he expanded that temple area, and of course this is on a mountain, so there has to be some fill going in there in order to bring it level. And then he built this. It encompasses about 35 acres. So this is a really large site. You may not notice that just from seeing this picture. So the work on this temple began in 20 BC, and the temple itself was finished in about a year and a half, and then another 8 years to complete some of the courts and the colonnades. But really, on this site, there was construction going on for the next 50 years. So this was also a grand temple. It was built with white marble and plates of gold. The historian Josephus compared it to a snow-covered mountain. And it was, according to him, was quite spectacular, a dazzling view from every side. Well, if we look a little bit at the layout of the temple, this may help us a little bit. You can see there the temple building, and in this sketch it's kind of offset, it's not dead center of the temple. And that area surrounding it, and it's with the yellow circle, that's called the Court of the Gentiles. And that's where we're going to have a lot of the action happening. But when Herod put this together, he wanted to keep the basic components of the Old Testament, so of the old temple. So there was a court of women, there was a court of Israel, there was a forecourt with an altar for the burnt offerings, There was a holy place and a holy of holies. So it had those same basic components. And he wanted to maintain this so he could keep up the trust of the people. So he gathered all the materials together before he started taking down the old temple and rebuilding it. As a part of this effort, he trained 1,000 priests to be masons and carpenters. And then in total, there were like 10,000 skilled workmen who were employed to build Herod's temple. So as you can see, this court of the Gentiles surrounding here does compose the majority of the space there. And this was the area, just as it sounds, where Gentiles were allowed to come. Anybody could come into that court. And then it was just the Jews who were then able to enter beyond that into the temple grounds proper. But the commercial activity that we read about tonight, when Jesus comes to cleanse the temple, that's happening out there in the court of the Gentiles. Okay. So it's really a large area. And that area could accommodate 60 or 70,000 people. So there might be that many people out in that courtyard, in addition to all of the people that were exchanging money and selling stuff, and all the animals that were there. So it was quite a scene where it was packed. As we said before, there were hundreds of thousands, maybe as many as 2 million people that came to Jerusalem for their pilgrimage or Passover. And again, maybe 70,000 of them could have been in the courtyard at any given time. So here's one more sketch of that, a little more simplified version. And this particular outline shows you that the shape is not a square rectangle, it's more of a trapezoid. It's got the one angled side there. But still, the court of the Gentiles taking up the majority of the area. Okay, so that's a little bit about the temple and the layout of the temple that Jesus is walking into. So that court of the Gentiles, that courtyard was really the hub of a very corrupt system that was overseen by the chief priests. This temple market area was also referred to as the bazaars of the sons of Annas. And Annas, of course, had been the high priest. He wasn't currently in this year that Jesus comes here, but he had been. And at the present time, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was the high priest. And these two guys kind of ran the whole operation there. And they would sell a franchise to the vendors who would come and set up their tables in the court. So some of them sold oil or sold animals, some of them were money changers. Now, not only did Annas and Caiaphas sell a franchise to the vendors, but they also took a percentage of all the sales that the vendors made. So this was a real cash cow for them, generated a lot of money. And of course, the activity went on all the time because there were always sacrifices to be made throughout the year. It really hit its peak around the time of Passover, which is where we are tonight in our lesson. And that was particularly because every male was required to make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Passover. So let's take a look at some of the activities that went on in this marketplace. First of all, when the Jews came to the temple at Passover, they had to pay a temple tax, and it was a half a shekel every time they came. Now, they had to pay this within a month of the Passover. So a month before the Passover, there would be different stations set up in and around Jerusalem where people would collect money, and you could go and you could pay your half the poll tax at that time. So people who lived in and near Jerusalem would often do that. They would go and pay it and get it taken care of. But if you lived some distance away, you couldn't do that. So you'd have to wait until you arrived in Jerusalem. So if you were arriving in Jerusalem from maybe a 3 or 4 day journey, and you hadn't paid your tax, well, then you had to pay it in the temple. And the catch was it had to be paid in the required currency. It had to be paid with a shekel. Okay? Now, at that time, There was Greek currency and Roman currency and Syrian and Egyptian currency. They were all very commonly used in trade in that day. The shekel, not so much. They were used by the Israelites. They weren't as common. And the Romans prohibited the Jews from minting any more money. So they couldn't go out and mint any more shekels. It's a limited amount. But the law says you've got to pay your temple tax with a half shekel. So if you came to Passover, you'd have to exchange whatever form of money you had, the Greek money or the Roman money, for a half shekel. And as you would expect, there was a convenience fee for exchanging the shekel. Sometimes they would charge like a 25% markup to get your half shekel. And if you may have had a coin that was worth more than a half shekel, you still had to pay your convenience fee, and you probably didn't always get correct change back when you got your change. So there was this money changer aspect to it, which was charging exorbitant rates. Then secondly, there were the people that sold animals. And the time of the Passover, in particular, is lambs, but they sold other animals, other sacrifices throughout the year. And the requirement was that there be an unblemished lamb that the people had to sacrifice for Passover. Well, very conveniently, you could purchase a lamb from one of the vendors that was there. But as you would expect, they put a hefty markup on those animals. But at least you knew that they were approved for sacrifice because the priest had already cleared them and approved them. Well, what if you lived a long distance away and you wanted to bring your own lamb from home? Well, you can do that. If you lived a few days' journey away, you could bring that lamb. And in fact, the law originally encouraged people to give the best of their flock. So let's review that in Exodus 12, 1 through 6. We have those original instructions about that first passage.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat, you shall make your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. I went too far, didn't I? You want to do the rest of that?
And then the 10th plague was, no.
Why don't somebody stop me?
It's so good.
So those original instructions from God through Moses to the people of Israel was that they would bring a lamb from their own flock. So there was this personal connection. And now it's morphed into something else like Jesus did. So yes, people could bring one of their own lambs with them. But if they did that, remember, the priest is the one who inspects the animal to make sure it has no blemish and that it's approved for the sacrifice. So if you brought your lamb and your lamb didn't pass the priest's inspection, now you were forced to buy one of their lambs, except they knew that you had tried to work around their little system, so now they really have you over a barrel. And so they were really exorbitant. Historical records indicate that the vendors would charge 10 or 15 times what the normal value of a lamb would be. Because, you know, it was like they had a lemon in their hand, they were going to squeeze it for every drop they could get out of it. Well, the priest took a healthy portion of the proceeds of that sale of those lambs, so it was to their advantage to find something wrong with any lamb that he may have brought from a farm. The money changers and the animal vendors brought a lot of money into the temple coffers. Now, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this, the Bible scholar Alfred Edersheim wrote in his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, that there was a Roman general and politician named Marcus Crassus. Well, Crassus and Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, they formed the first triumvirate as Rome was moving from a republic to an empire. Edersheim says that General Crassus was in Jerusalem one time, and he plundered the Jerusalem temple treasury. This is in 54 BC. So at that time, the haul amounted to 2.5 million pounds sterling. Okay. Well, Edersheim is writing this in the early 1880s. So if we do a little conversion to modern day, that equates to over $500 million. So this was the size of their treasury in 54 BC. So just, I mean, unspeakable amounts of money that are flowing through this treasury because of all this graft and corruption that's taking place in the marketplace. And then the third thing that I would highlight that was going on there, and this maybe was the most despicable of all, there were people there who sold doves and pigeons. Now, the law made a provision for the poor, those who couldn't afford to bring forth a lamb as a sacrifice. For example, when a child was born, a lamb was required as a sacrifice, but the Lord made a provision for that. Somebody has Leviticus 12, 6 and 8.
And when the days of the purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb, a year old, for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And if she can't afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean.
So God made provision for the poor people. He had a concern in the heart for them. In today's money, one of these doves would cost about a dime, about 10 cents. But these vendors in the marketplace there in the court of the Gentiles outside the temple would charge $10. So they had no conscience about defrauding the poor. Well, there was similar corruption in the sale of wine and oil and other goods that the Jews needed to meet the demand for the law and their sacrifices. So the court of Gentiles was filled with tables of sellers and money changers, particularly at the time of the Passover. And it took a lot of them to service all the pilgrims that came in for the Passover. So this bazaar of Annas was corrupt from the top down. And not only was the system corrupt, but as you can imagine, it attracted all kinds of other crooks and con men, in addition to the legal crooks and vendors. So you can just imagine the opportunity for evil that went on in this thing. And it's also interesting to note that when Jesus was arrested a few days later, where was the first place he went? They took him to Annas, the house of Annas. So, interesting confrontation. What was Annas thinking as he saw Jesus bound, standing in front of him, this man who had upset his marketplace just a few days before? Well, yeah, I guess I'll say it. I wasn't sure I'd say this, but I was just reminded of this, that sometimes people draw an analogy between the selling of the temple and some activities that go on in churches. And so people don't want to have a table selling books or selling CDs, and we put it outside, and I think that's a good thing. And we don't want to make a lot of commerce, and in fact, in this church, we don't even pass an offering plate, right? We have offering boxes in the back, and I think that's good to de-emphasize that, but also let's make sure we don't want to confuse that activity of maybe selling a speaker's books with what's going on in town. There's no comparison. In fact, if we do that, we kind of minimize the evil that was happening in the temple. So I'll leave it at that. So now let's pull all this together and think about what the scene was like there at the court of the Gentiles during Passover week. This could be the size of about 10 football fields, maybe, perhaps more. There are all these pilgrims that have come to Jerusalem. There might be 70,000 of them that are in the court of the Gentiles at any given time. The court is filled with these tables of sellers and money changers. And remember, this is the Middle Eastern marketplace. There's a lot of loud shouting and haggling and bickering over prices and scales to weigh the silver and gold and debating the exchange rates. And then there's all the sheep and the other animals that are around there. I know the last time you walked through a sheep pasture, but smelly and dirty. So this is the vile, corrupt setting that Jesus is walking into. He's not just stepping into the temple building like we see depicted in art sometimes, but it's really quite a crazy setting, corrupt and pretty repulsive. Well, Jesus had previously come to the temple and cleansed it. And this happened early on in his ministry. And John records this. Somebody has John 2:11 through 17. Let's review that.
This miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was Jesus' first display of his glory, and his disciples believed in it. After the wedding, he went to Capernaum for a few days with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. It was time for the annual Passover celebration, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices, and he saw money changers behind their counters. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and oxen, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Don't turn my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures, "Passion for God's house burns within me."
Well, this occurred shortly after Jesus did his first miracle when he turned the water into wine in Cana. He left there, went to Capernaum, and then was there for a few days, and then he went into Jerusalem and cleansed the temple at that time. Again, it was at the time of Passover then. And in this case, John tells us that Jesus made a whip and used that to clear out the sheep and the oxen out of the courtyard. So Jesus cleansing the temple was one of the early events, one of the first events in his ministry, and now it's one of the last events in his ministry. Well, the Jews at the time of the triumphal entry, they had effectively crowned Jesus their king during that entry, and they were hoping that he might head to that Antonia fortress up there in the corner of the temple complex, where the Roman soldiers were housed. They thought he's going to lead this political, maybe military rebellion. Instead, his first official act, as their king, as it were, was to enter the temple grounds. He addressed the corruption that was taking place in the court of the Gentiles. And this priority reminds us of some of the words of Peter. Some of us, 1 Peter 4:17.
For the time has come for judgments to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God?
Beginning at the house of God. And then Mark 11:11. Somebody has that.
And he entered Jerusalem, and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, and it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12.
So Mark tells us that as Jesus entered the city in the triumphal entry, he went into the temple, he saw what was going on, and then it was late in the day, so he went back to Bethany, and he stayed at Bethany. We've talked about how Jesus was effectively commuting from Bethany to Jerusalem during this whole week. So we don't quite get that impression in Luke. It kind of runs together, but actually this cleansing of the temple is happening the next day after his entry into Jerusalem. So then Jesus returns to Jerusalem and to the temple the following morning, and he drives out the people who were selling the animals. Matthew and Mark add in their account that Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and drove out those who sold pigeons. Now, Jesus isn't just flipping over a couple of tables in a church foyer somewhere, but he's dealing with an area the size of 10 football fields. He's got dozens of stalls of animals, and tables, and money changers. So just imagine the persistence and the effort it took to drive all of that out of them. Driving them out of the court of the Gentiles. So Luke doesn't talk about driving out the animals as he did the first time, but we do read that in the other accounts. So we suspect that's part of what's happening here. So just think of the strength that it took to do that. It wasn't something that happened just in a couple minutes of flipping over a couple of tables that were in the entryway, but it was quite a spectacle that was happening there, with all those tens of thousands of people present as well. So in doing this, Jesus is also fulfilling the words in Malachi 3. Somebody has Malachi 3:1-3.
Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord.
So Jesus is coming with the Messiah is coming with the zeal for the temple and to cleanse and purify. Well, got a couple of paintings for you to look at. This one is by the artist El Greco, called The Purification of the Temple. And while it looks like it's happening inside the building rather than outside, as was the case, and we don't really get quite the full magnitude of it, we do see the determination on Jesus' face, and we see some of the reactions of the other money changers and sellers that are there. And then one more. This is by the Dutch artist Hertzen. And this captures some of the chaos and the upheaval. Again, it looks like he is outside in this case. We don't quite get the scope of it, of the whole court of the Gentiles, but we do get a little bit of a flavor for what's going on here. And in both these cases, Jesus has the whip, so he's more inspired by John's account than what we see here in Luke, but it's a similar type thing going on. So you can see the dramatic effects of the actions Jesus is taking. Well, then in verse 46, Jesus quotes Isaiah 56:7 when he says, "My house will be called a house of prayer." This is why Jesus is doing what he's doing. The Jewish leaders have polluted God's house that was intended to be a place of prayer. Now, John adds that the first cleansing, John adds another quote when he gives his account. The disciples recall a verse from the Psalm. Somebody has Psalm 69:9.
For zeal for your house has consumed me. The reproaches of these who reproach you have fallen upon me.
So the disciples recognized that it was a psalm that talked about Jesus and the zeal that he would have. He was zealous for his Father's house and for it to be a house of prayer. Now it's interesting, the larger section that Isaiah is talking about, where the Gentiles are to be gathered into the house. Somebody has Isaiah 56, 6 through 8.
Okay. Isaiah 56, 6
Yeah.
to 8. And foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to serve him, to love the name of the Lord and to worship him, who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant. This I will bring to my holy mountain. Give him joy in my house of prayer. The burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The sovereign Lord declares, he who gathers the exiles of Israel, I will gather still others to them, besides those who already gathered.
So, as Isaiah predicted there, and Jesus is filling out, this house was to be a house of prayer, but notice it's not just for the Jews, it's a house of prayer for all nations. So, a little idea there that God is extending his grace to all nations. He had called Israel to be a light to the nations. Some is Isaiah 42, 5, 7 through 8. I'm sorry, 5 through 7.
Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant to the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols.
So this house of prayer, there's room in this house for not only the outcasts of Israel, but others beside that. It's not the place where the graft and corruption is going on there right now. So, given what we've already talked about, we have no trouble seeing why Jesus called this a robber's den. It certainly was that. He's quoting from Jeremiah 7:11. I think somebody did something.
As this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes, Lord, I myself have seen the name of the Lord.
So Jesus is looking back at that person in Jeremiah. So we have these, quote, legitimate robbers, we've got illegitimate robbers, and everybody was more than happy to take advantage of the stranger and take advantage of the poor. Well, we often hear about the phrase about righteous anger or righteous indignation, and it's often used in conjunction with this passage. None of the gospel accounts use the word anger. They talk about Jesus having a zeal for the house of the Lord. And I just think sometimes we need to be a little bit cautious about trying to justify our anger. And so I'm a little careful in applying that to this passage. Certainly, Jesus has a passion here. a lot of strength and a lot of effort behind what he's doing. But I think we should just be careful about attaching anger to that. Sometimes we find a way to justify our own anger, and it can be just as uncontrollable as our tongue. So we should be careful. It can get to be a slippery slope if we start to justify some of our anger. And I won't go into a lot more than that, but I would just refer you to go back and review some of Pastor Gary's messages. I think when we talked about the verse in Ephesians 4 that talks about be angry and sin not. He had a couple of messages about that that were very good and really touch on this whole idea of a Christian and anger. So I'll leave that there for tonight. Okay. So in the days following the cleansing of the temple, Jesus returned there to teach each day. And we see that in verse 47. Now, some of those teachings that he gave are recorded in the following chapters 20 and 21 of Luke. Luke 20, verse 1 says that not only was Jesus teaching, but he was also preaching the gospel. So Jesus knows that his time is drawing near, and here he is doing what will be of the most value, teaching and preaching the gospel in the temple. Even though the people won't understand everything he says, he knows that soon the Holy Spirit will come and make all things clear and bring things to their remembrance. So it is Matthew 21, 14 through 17.
And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise? And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there.
So Jesus is teaching, he's preaching the gospel, and he's healing during these last days. So at the end, he's still caring for others. He's focused on others. And we also see during this time that the children are still shouting. They're refraining from the triumphal entry, Hosanna to the Son of David. Well, seeing all this, what's the response from the chief priests and the scribes? They saw the miracles. They heard the children shouting. They heard the wise teaching. Did they think that maybe there was some truth in all this, something to look at, to observe? No. Verse 47 tells us that the leaders were seeking to destroy him. The word destroy in Greek is the word apollone, and it means to kill. It's the same word that's used in Matthew 2:13 when the angel warns Joseph that Herod wants to destroy the child Jesus, that same word. Apollone. So since his birth on earth, people have been trying to kill Jesus. And the irony here is that the very thing that these evildoers want to do to Jesus, in time is going to happen to them if they don't repent. So it's Matthew 10:39.
I got it.
Okay.
Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.
So that phrase, lose his life, that's our same word. And that's what's going to happen to these priests and if they don't turn and repent. Well, as the author of life is giving out the word of life, the religious leaders are seeking to kill him. These chief priests did not recognize the one who mediates for all believers as our great high priest. We read about that in Hebrews 4:14 to 16. Who is that?
can read it.
Yeah, that'd be great, thanks.
Okay, so Hebrews 4:14, 16. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who is in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Is that the correct definition?
Yeah, that's it. So Jesus is going to be our high priest. So here he is preaching the gospel and offering life to these leaders also, even though they're trying to kill him. They were lost and they couldn't see it. Now, in Mark's account, Mark adds that the reason they wanted to destroy him was because the crowd was astonished at his teaching. The Greek word for astonished is a strong one, and the roots of the compound word means flattened. The teaching of Jesus was unlike anything they had heard. It was so different from the teaching of the Pharisees that it flattened them. We might say it floored us. The same kind of idea. In verse 48, Luke says the crowd was hanging on to every word he said. The literal idiom here is they were hanging on to his lips. Isn't that beautiful? What a wonderful word picture that is of the attention that they afforded Jesus. The people immediately recognized the difference. The chief priests were afraid of the crowd. This is the crowd which had just proclaimed Jesus to be Messiah and King. The chief priests and the scribes would have liked to arrest and execute Jesus right away, but it was politically and tactically impossible at that moment. So they were going to bide their time, make their plans, and resort to more devious means to trap Jesus and arrest him. Okay, so as we wrap up, let's talk a couple of application questions. What do we say about God? What do we learn about God in this passage?
He's not pleased with people taking advantage of other people.
Temple is supposed to be a worship, not a money-making deal.
Yeah.
He hates sin.
I hate sin.
Teaches patiently. Or patiently.
How do you respond when God does something that doesn't fit your expectations?
Yeah, that's good.
Hmm?
That's both from last time. You have a different question on your paper.
Another the wrong question? Oh, you did?
That's good.
That was last week. Okay, well, let's read off of your sheet then. In what ways can the church today be made into a den of robbers?
The people who like basically make their business from people at church.
Yep. Even people who use the church as a way to make contacts.
Yeah.
I recently saw a clip of, and not to name names, but I'm going to, of a particular religious person that owned a big furniture conglomerate and a man of Christ, and compared it to Joel Osteen during a storm. And he said he opened up all his doors for all his businesses. And he said, you know, any poor, wherever you guys come sleep, I don't care. Sleep on the couches, sleep on all the new furniture. Whereas they just finished a church under that person that I just said, and they're in new carpets and everything. And he didn't want them to come in and dirty the place.
It's true, I was used to it. It was a big deal. Big.
Oh God. So, like, I didn't know it was that big of a deal. I just kind of saw it as a tidbit thing, you know?
Because they were in dire straits and they needed help and places to go. And he wouldn't open up, and other churches were. Oh, yeah, it was a real big controversy.
And just to see the self-made, well, millionaire, they're like, hey, just come into all my stores, open to, didn't care. You know, and I think that it's a good example of that.
Who is this?
Joel Osteen owns church. It's like 40 minutes from my house. Eventually he did. Yes, he had to. The pressure, the outrage.
And we lived briefly in Houston at that time, and that church was still a basketball arena.
The temple.
And people ask me, oh, have you been to his church? No.
I haven't, it wasn't church that time. All right, and then the last question. How would your prayer life be helped by hanging on the words of Jesus?
Okay, so can I say something about this? There have been times in my life where, hour by hour, I hang on to the words of Jesus because what I'm going through is so hard. But I don't want to be like that every day. I mean, I want to read the Bible and do my, Bible study and everything, but hanging on to the words, that's like you're just desperate, you're just hanging on. I don't want to feel that every day. I want to go to the throne of grace and be grateful and be thanking for everything he's done. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know if the question is, I see how you want to take that. I don't think the intent of the question is necessarily that feeling, right? But that we would have that as a priority, that we would have the words of Jesus in the forefront all the time. I think it's more like that.
Okay, well, then I read it wrong.
It's so interesting that how hard it is, to hang on the words, and how desperate you have to be to get to that.
Yeah, maybe we don't realize, maybe we're not desperate enough sometimes.
Maybe we need to be a little more desperate in our real life. Or recognize each day to be less. Really hard.
Okay, any closing comments